What's up, y'all? Today I want to make a really important video about one of my favorite topics, communism. Now, if you're not already aware, Geomancer is, always has been, and always will be an explicitly communist project. I myself am a lifelong communist and orthodox Marxist, so this video is really foundational to everything we're trying to do here with the organization, which is to develop a coherent long-term discourse, our own independent politics, and be able to communicate intelligently about our projects in that context. So communism, I think it probably goes without saying, is an incredibly complex topic. It's one that has been the target of a lot of malicious obfuscation and bad faith arguments, often by those who have an interest in confusing and distorting our ability to meaningfully interpret the world. And so all the more reason why we have to be really clear about what we're talking about and set the boundaries of what we are aligning ourselves to here so that we can control our own narrative. So, for instance, there are people out there who would tell you that reprehensible dictators like Joseph Stalin were communist, or that a semi-feudal monarchy like North Korea is somehow communist. And these assertions are not just absurd, but they actually insult our intelligence. So again, all the more important for us to be really clear about what we're talking about and what we're not talking about. And since this, of course, is Geomancer's channel, we have the privilege of saying, okay, this is what we're defining communism as. When we use the word communism, this is what we have an affinity with. And if you want to come and join this conversation with us, these are the conditions we've set for that conversation to take place. And you may think of this as gatekeeping, and that's fine, because we have to preserve the intellectual integrity of the organization. And staking out these kinds of definitions is really just a simple prerequisite to our being able to curate a credible discussion about a topic that has been the target of so much misinformation. So, what is communism and what is it not? Generally speaking, I think a lot of people see the communist ideal as being a society without class divisions, nor the kind of state apparatus necessitated by the enforcement and maintenance of that kind of social stratification. And that's a great starting point. But I think if you ask the average person on the street, they would probably tell you that communism is a system of government, or maybe it's a mode of economic production, or a way to organize things so as to achieve that classless society we're looking for. And it's actually none of those things. So let's take a step back and really appreciate what I'm saying here. Communism is not a system of government. It's not any kind of system at all, actually. What communism is the tendency in human history towards community, towards collaboration, away from alienation. And so it's not actually something that's fixed in time. It's rather a dynamic, kind of ever-changing, ever-evolving movement with a lot of contradictions within itself, things that we can analyze throughout history as being signifiers of the communist tendency, but there is no ultimate expression of it. There is no final climax stage that we're working towards or anything like that. So to explain this a little better, I'm going to pull up a quote here from Karl Marx. This is from the German Ideology, and Marx writes, quote, "Communism is for us not a state of affairs which is to be established, an ideal to which reality will have to adjust itself. We call communism the real movement which abolishes the present state of things. The conditions of this movement result from premises now in existence." End quote. So let's take this one piece at a time here. Marx says, communism is for us not a state of affairs which is to be established or an ideal to which reality will have to adjust itself. So right there, it's not a state of affairs to be established. It's not a system of government. It's not something that you put into place or convince others to put into place. That's not what it is. He says we call communism the real movement which abolishes the present state of things. So communism is this living tendency in human history that moves us towards cooperation and collective benefit. It is not something that just came up as part of the struggle against capitalism in the last few hundred years. It is something that we can see throughout history as an emergent property of human nature and culture, as a kind of an innate principle of what it means for people to come together, to be in society, to be in association, and to collaborate. So, we use the word communism in spite of the great likelihood that we will be misunderstood, perhaps intentionally, because there is simply no better word for this thing we are describing. In the very root of the word communism, we understand that there must be communal activity. And so when people speak of an authoritarian communism, that is meaningless. It's a contradiction in terms. And that's not just me trying to hand wave this stuff and say, oh, we're not associated with those kinds of communists. But, these authoritarian so-called communist regimes in places like the Soviet Union have only ever succeeded in replicating capitalism under state-controlled forms. So how can we call that communism? Similarly, some people will seek to modify the word communism by adding the words anarchist or libertarian, autonomist, etc. And these terms to me are entirely redundant because, again, the liberatory impulse is intrinsic to communism, as is the struggle against alienation and oppression in all its forms. So there's no real reason to qualify it as such. Communism stands on its own 2 feet as an inalienable fact of human liberation. So hopefully this makes sense to you, that communism is a tendency in human society. It is not a fixed system or form of government. But perhaps at this point you're saying, well, you're being academic and saying that communism isn't a real thing, it's this nebulous, broader concept and so forth. And I want to make clear that that's not what I'm saying at all. Remember that we are talking about a real material movement. And as Marx wrote, the conditions of this movement result from premises now in existence. So communism is explicitly a material tendency in history. It is not just an academic branch of Western philosophy, but rather expresses itself in real, practical terms and should be engaged with on that basis. Furthermore, I want to say that the sophistication and nuance of this idea that communism is not a fixed point in time, but rather an ongoing development, that's really the whole point of Marxist methodology, is to be able to stake out these philosophically distinct perspectives that are denied to us by bourgeois media and culture, and which allow us to orient ourselves to the world around us in such a way that clarifies the conditions of our lives and allows us to develop strategies to meaningfully improve those conditions in real time. Now, this idea of communism as a dynamic process rather than a fixed destination is actually pretty interesting because it has a good analog in the concept of ecological succession, which for many good reasons is a paradigm that has fallen out of favor. But for a long time, Western ecologists put forth this idea of succession in which the community dynamics of a given ecosystem would always be inexorably progressing towards a certain stable community composition that was defined as the climax state. So, for instance, an old-growth temperate forest. Now, certainly some people look at history this way as well, and even slander Marxists by saying that we subscribe to such a theory of fixed historical stages that must be mechanistically passed through in unilinear sequence. But as permaculturists, we understand that that's not how natural systems work, right? There are all sorts of different disturbance effects and shifting patterns on the landscape, just as there are in human history and human societies, and there is no end of history, no single fixed point of development that we are working towards any more than there is an end to forest ecology. Rather, there is just this evolving dialectical process that we find ourselves in the middle of. I remember one time someone asked me what the end goal of communism is. They said, what does it look like? Describe to me that final stage you're working to achieve. And of course, the answer to that is precisely that there is no end goal. There is no final climax. This is an ongoing, dynamic process, and as frustrating as that complexity may be, it actually opens up some pretty interesting perspectives for our ability to use communist ideas, not just as a performative ideological straitjacket, but to actually interpret the world as it exists and see the opportunities in it to advance the communist tendency in history. So I hope that wasn't confusing. I hope that's clear how we're using the term communism in this way, why we are using it in this way, and that this is how Geomancer defines communism and what we mean when we use the term in our materials, including on this channel. So the last thing I want to touch on really briefly is just to say, okay, if we accept that communism is a tendency in human history rather than a fixed economic or political system, then what does it mean to be a communist? Who is a communist? And again, this is where I'm not trying to gatekeep or anything like that and say who is a real communist and who isn't, but my definition is very simple. It's just that a communist is anyone who recognizes that tendency in human history towards community, away from alienation and exploitation, and they participate in some form or fashion in actions that remove barriers to that tendency, remove the barriers to human interaction and collaboration in their community. And so that's really all it takes to be a communist. But we want to be careful in distinguishing here between a communist and an activist, which is someone who believes that their activity is going to affect material conditions and potentially change the course of history. Communists are not activists. We do not engage in activism. What the communist does is recognize that there is this larger tendency, the communist tendency, playing itself out in human culture, and that the dynamics of this tendency, its course of development and evolution, are an aggregate of myriad different geographic, historical, and socioeconomic factors that we as individuals do not have control over. But what the communists can do is, again, recognize the existence of this tendency towards cooperation and community and agitate in whatever fashion for the removal of obstacles to it so that it may seek a more developed and fuller expression of itself. We are not the originators of history, but we can be an organized, subjective force within it. And then really the last thing I'll say is that if we've defined communism as a tendency in human history, and we've defined a communist as someone who agitates for the removal of obstacles in the way of that tendency, then what is Marxism? Marxism is a particular system of thought, a philosophy that one can use to interpret the communist movement and the communist tendency in history, so that as a communist, one can develop a strategic perspective in terms of what are the obstacles to the progression of that tendency and which ones should we be removing. But of course, that is a much larger question. Marxism itself is a fully developed body of thought that I'm not going to cover in this video, but suffice it to say that it is of course possible to be a communist without being a Marxist. Marxism is simply a framework that certain communists, myself included, utilize in order to understand and clarify our goals. So anyway, thanks for watching this video, and hopefully this has been helpful both to people interested in permaculture and also to communists more widely. And maybe that can serve as an inspiration for more communists to get involved in permaculture, because I think it's a really powerful tool with which we can impact the world around us and invite more and more people to become directly engaged with making collective decisions about the material conditions of our daily lives.